as I said, this is just a presentation of the Inspire reference validator. And I'd like just to start with a short introduction on Inspire, which is a directive that aims to create a legal, but also a technical and an organizational framework for the creation of a European Spatial Data Infrastructure, SDI, to support EU environmental policies. This infrastructure should be built on top of the spatial data infrastructures of the member states, so which are already existing and already operated by the single member states. Inspire was conceived starting from 2001. The directive entered into force in 2007, and its full implementation is foreseen for 2021. So Inspire, as I said, is an environmental directive, and the spatial data sets that fall under the scope of Inspire are divided into 34 cross-sectoral categories, which are called spatial data themes, and they belong to 3 annexes because they are actually listed in the annexes of the directive. So basically, Annex 1 and Annex 2 deal with baseline information, while Annex 3 deals with more domain-specific information. So here you can see basically all these 34 spatial data themes. From the practical point of view, the directive is complemented by so-called implementing rules and technical guidelines. So implementing rules that you see on the top of the slide are legally binding documents. So they say what the member states must do to fulfill the Inspire requirements, so the legal obligations, in terms of the different components, which are basically metadata, metadata to discover the data, data specifications for each of the 34 spatial data themes, so basically the conceptual data models, and the network services, which are divided into discovery services to discover the data through the metadata, view services, and download services to access and to download the data. Then we have the technical guidelines, which are non-legally binding, so they basically say how member states might implement the Inspire directive from the technical point of view, and they make explicit reference to the OGC and to the ISO geospatial standards. And finally, at the bottom of the slide, we have tools for Inspire implementation, and one of these tools is clearly the validator. So why an Inspire validator? First of all, for different reasons. First, to help member states, data providers to test their resources. So again, metadata, datasets and services against the requirements of Inspire. But the validator is also a tool for Inspire coordinators, so both at the EU level, so for us basically, but also coordinators at the member states national level to monitor the Inspire implementation progress. The validator is also a reference tool for all the software providers which develop solutions for Inspire. Think, for example, to GeoNetwork or GeoServer or MapServer or Degree, and so on. And the validator was and is still funded by the ISA and ISA Square programs in the past, the ARENA, and currently under the ELISE actions. So the validator is actually not a single software, but it's based on a number of components. The starting point is still represented by the Inspire technical guidelines, which, as I said, define requirements for all the resources, so metadata, datasets, and services. These technical guidelines in the first step are translated into abstract test suites, or ATS, which are the abstract or the high-level descriptions of test cases. In turn, these are translated into ETS, so executable test suites, which are the concrete, so the low-level descriptions of the test cases that can be executed by programs. And finally, we have the ETS testing framework, which is the software where the ETS are run. So when we speak about the Inspire reference validator, we actually mean the set of these components. More in detail, the ATS and the ETS, so the abstract and the executable test suites, are always developed in agreement with a specific subgroup of the MIG, which is the Inspire Maintenance and Implementation Group. It's a group of experts, basically, and they are all published and maintained on GitHub, so everything under open source licenses. We currently have ATS and ETS for metadata, for CSW discovery services, WMS and WMTS view services, and Atom, WFS, WCS, and SOS download services. In terms of data sets, there are ATS and ETS for cross-cutting requirements, and then ATS and ETS for those spatial data themes falling under Annex 1 of the directive. And then we have the ETF testing framework, which is basically the software where the ETS can be run. The ETF is an open source testing framework that allows to validate any resource in an SDI, and any deployment is composed of a database, one or more test engines to execute the ETS, and a servlet container to host the web application. Currently, the ETF has test drivers for 3 test engines, so SOAP UI to test web services, BaseX to test XML documents, and Team Engine, which is also the testing tool used by the OGC. The ETF and in turn the Inspire reference validator that is based on the ETF, they can be used either through HTML web interface or through a REST API, and a Docker image is also available for quick deployment. This is basically how the web application of the reference validator looks like. And so first thing is to select the type of resource you want to test, as well as the conformance classes that you want to test. Then you have to provide clearly the resource to be tested. So if it is a data set or a metadata, you should upload the resource or put a link to the resource. If it is a service, you need to enter the service endpoint. Then you start the test is executed, and you can access the test report. This is basically how it looks like for each of the conformance classes you tested. Then you can expand it and have access to the details of which tests passed, which tests failed, and which tests perhaps require a manual check by the users, because not all the tests can be automated. So some tests may require a manual check from the users. But as I said, you can also use the Inspire validator through the API, which is published and documented using OpenAPI. I'm happy to say that more and more member states are actually starting to make their validation using the API that clearly allows to automate the tests and to test a lot of resources at the same time or with less effort. Important to say that in terms of functionality, in particular in the interface, there is a steering group for the ETF software, which is complemented by a technical committee. The role of the technical committee is clearly more to provide technical feedback on the improvement proposals and to review pull requests. Then clearly it's an open source software, so any contribution from anyone is more than welcome, and contribution guidelines are regulated by the EUPL and by the Developer Certificate of Origin. If you want to have an idea of what are the current improvement proposals under discussion or under analysis from the technical committee or under, let's say, already planned for release, you can just access this project board on GitHub. The link is below. Instead, the main interaction, or actually all the interactions with the Inspire community, happen through the so-called community space, which is another repository on GitHub in the same GitHub workspace that I mentioned before. This is meant to be really the single point of access to anything about the validator. So we provide here a changelog and a release planning document to inform users about the current and also the future developments of the validator. And we also provide a single help desk where users can report problems with the validator or propose new features of the validator, or also open discussions about the validator. So it's really the single place where we want anything about the validator to occur. And well, in terms of current and future work, probably the most important news is that we are now using the validator to test the conformity of metadata within the Inspire monitoring and reporting. This is absolutely new, because in the past, the monitoring and reporting didn't happen through the validator. In terms of ATS and ETS, we are working to basically finalize the set of test suites by adding those for Annex 2 and 3 data specifications. These will also address testing coverage datasets. But also interesting is that we might in the future add the new test suites according to requirements emerging from the INSPIRE maintenance and implementation work program, and in particular about validation of data sets encoded using alternative encodings, for example, GeoJSON, because you know that the INSPIRE default encoding is GML, but another action of the MIG, the INSPIRE maintenance and implementation group, was exactly on alternative encodings, and a GeoJSON encoding of INSPIRE data was developed. Then I'd like to close just by mentioning this workshop that we had at the beginning of October. It was a 2-day workshop, 1 day for users of the validator and 1 day for developers. We produced some training material for the workshop that we decided to make available, again, on GitHub for the benefit of everyone. So it basically consists of presentations, but also some step-by-step tutorials on how to perform validation through the web application and through the API. That's it. Hope it was useful, and of course I'm open to any question. Thanks.